Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this Regions in Recovery second Global E-Festival that is organized by Regional Studies Association together with a number of partners. So this is the first early career plenary panel, and I'm very happy to introduce you to the speakers of today. The event started this morning and is still running until the 1st of April, so I encourage you to check out also all the other sessions. And all non-presenting delegates can still register for free on the RSA website. So it's really a good opportunity for everyone to join the debate in some ways. Please, if I can ask you to keep muted at all times, unless you're being called for asking your questions at the end. There will be an opportunity, and you have also Q&A button. You can type your questions in the chat as well. I will read them at the end. This meeting is recorded and it will be made available on the RSA hub after the event. So if you wish to stay private, please keep your video turned off and do not unmute yourself to ask a question. I can just read it out from the chat, as I said. Now there's a chat button, as I mentioned, so you can just type it in by using the letter Q at the beginning, so that it will make it easier for us at the end to read and identify the question. You can also raise your hand in case you want to ask the question yourself, and I will call you in the order that I will see on my screen to ask it. And I will also ask you to unmute, of course, yourself. Now, just to briefly introduce myself, I am Dr. Stefania Fiorentino, and I'm a senior teaching associate in planning, growth and urban regeneration at the Department of Land Economy at the University of Cambridge. My research interests look at the ways to reconcile urban planning with local economic development issues, and at the moment I'm looking at things like planning the post-COVID city, the regeneration of coastal towns, and a project on density and sustainability in cities. So I'm really interested myself into the topics that will be covered by today's session. Now, without further ado, I will introduce you the two speakers of today. And the first one is Karel van der Berghe. He's an assistant professor in spatial and urban planning and economics at the Department of Management in the Built Environment at the Faculty of Architecture and the Built Environment at Delft University of Technology in the Netherlands. He holds a master in geography and a master in spatial planning, and he published his PhD in spatial planning on the topic of planning the port city. His current research and education focuses on the spatial policy making and the geostrategic challenges of the circular economy, the role of remanufacturing industries, port cities, polycentric urban and port systems, and policy coherence. He has published widely in international and national academic and professional journals, books and books chapters on the same topics. And lastly, he is also an advisor and expert for different port authorities, municipalities, regions, national spatial policy making institutions. So he will be the first speaker of today. And the second speaker is Linda Westman from the University of Sheffield in the UK. She's a research associate at the Urban Institute. Her work engages with environmental politics, including dimensions such as urban climate governance, transformations, and justice. She currently manages a work package of the ERC-funded project Law Act, which examines climate innovation in ordinary cities. Linda is a chapter scientist and contributing author of Chapter 6 of the IPCC Assessment Report 6. She's also co-founder of the Urban Working Group of the Earth System Governance Network. And before joining the Urban Institute, Linda was based at the University of Waterloo in Canada, where she conducted research on sustainable business innovation. And before becoming an academic, she was employed as a senior policy analyst at the Science and Innovation Office of the Embassy of Sweden in Beijing. So, after the introductions, I now leave the floor to Karel. Thank you.
Thank you for the very well introduction. I will share my screen now. Yes, I'm ready. So while the introduction was already there, so I can only repeat that I am indeed Karel van der Berghe, and I'm an assistant professor of spatial planning in Delft. And I'm very honored, very honored that I can give you this presentation among three very impressive academics. So yeah, I'm very honored to share my latest article that I, of course, co-authored with my colleagues, and the paper I will present and the outcomes and the setting of the paper. That paper is called Friends with Benefits, with subtitle The Emergence of the Amsterdam, Rotterdam, Antwerp, which is ARA, Polycentric Port Region, and that paper has been published 1 or 2 months ago in the RSA journal Territorial Politics and Governance. The paper itself has a beautiful history. It has been developed within the RSA research network of polycentricity that had several network events in Loughborough and also in Delft, where we and I mean that network have discussed this paper. So it's in fact, you could say, although there are 4 authors on the paper, many more that have contributed. So thanks to all of them. Well, I just start with the end result. It's always nice, so everybody who wants to leave can leave after this slide, but please stay for the rest of the story and of course for the next speaker. Well, the ARA polycentric port area is an emergent system, and there is no clear agency and control. And those 2 elements I will of course explain in the presentation. But for most, the last part, the agency or the no agency, is quite innovative in the polycentric literature. So what's the structure of the presentation? First, I will go into the introduction. Where do we position this paper? Then I will explain our analytical framework we developed. I go then into the empirics, where I will explain the 3 dimensions, the discussion, and at last the conclusion. The conclusion will take the paper in a broader setting and will look into the question, what are the lessons for the energy transition and circular economy, among others. So where are we? Where is this paper situated, or where has this paper done its research? It has done its research in the Low Countries, and the Low Countries are the Netherlands and Belgium, which is basically, from a geographical, physical point of view, the Rhine-Scheldt-Meuse river delta. And quite remarkable is that in that area, there's a very high concentration of large ports, and you see them here dotted on the right side of this slide. And there are many more than ARA, but in general, with the ARA region, which is Amsterdam, Rotterdam, Antwerp, they also include automatically, and I will explain that later on, the ports of Moerdijk, and then in Belgium, the ports of the North Sea port, which in fact, I have to correct myself, a Dutch-Belgian port. So it's a merger, a recent merger of the port of Ghent and the port of Zeeland. And the latest is the port of Bruges. So basically, these are very large ports. Rotterdam and Antwerp are the biggest ports in Europe, so very close to each other. And while only looking at this map, it invokes the notion of polycentricity. But in the literature, in the port literature, that concept has not really truly been explored. So what is polycentricity? So polycentricity within geographical literature is quite a known concept, but for most in urban studies, in urban literature. And then it's called polycentric urban regions, which is then abbreviated as PUR. That's, like I said, a well-established concept within urban studies and regional sciences, also in RSA journals. Yeah, that was I explained. So basically, there are many around the world, but you could argue, many argue this, that the PUR archetypes, or at least where a lot of research has been dedicated to, are also situated in these low countries, in Belgium and the Netherlands. So the Belgian one is called the Flemish Diamond, with the 4 cities, Ghent, Antwerp, Leuven, and Brussels. And in the Netherlands, that's the most known, of course, is the Randstad. And the Randstad is a bunch of cities together, closely related to each other, whereas mostly Rotterdam, Amsterdam, Utrecht, and The Hague, and well, Delft, where I'm situated, is also in the Randstad. But what's often forgotten, and I just showed the map before, is that in fact many of these cities are also ports. So what we have tried to do is that we started to enact a dialogue between, on the one hand, that very rich port literature, and on the other hand, that port geography literature. So why did we do that? Like I explained, the port literature, they examine the connectivity and or complementarity within regionalized urban systems, which is basically another narrative than the dominant American one, focusing on megapolises and the core periphery dichotomy. So that has been developed that, okay, but we some parts in Europe, we see other urban regionalized systems out there, and polycentricity has helped to understand it. So basically what it does is to look from a morphological or a functional perspective, how or if and how are these urban regions or urban cities connected within that region. But what has been quite not explored within in the PER literature, although I said many of these PER archetypes are port cities, is exactly the role of ports in the growth of cities. And that's other literature that has said that the role of ports is very important to understand the growth of cities. And another one is that not that much attention has been paid to the micro level decision of actors. And of course, on the other hand, there's the port literature, and also, of course, in the port literature, these, like the Low Countries have been studied, and what has been always said that the Low Countries is an example of a multi-gateway port. So what basically the Low Countries are is the gateway to the rest of Europe, for most to Germany. And the reason that these ports are so closely located is because they compete mostly, but also cooperate in overlapping in serving these hinterlands, and that's this literature. But of course, this literature also some things not explored, and what they did not have done that much until now is that they didn't have include how firms, the firms itself, not the port as a whole, but the firms within the ports compete or cooperate within the port, but also between ports. So this is the dialogue we have enacted in this paper, and well, what is then, where does polycentricity come from? It's quite an old concept, more than a century old. It origins from the American Chicago School of Sociology, and then traveled towards a dialogue with the European side, and by now also to the rest of the world. Originally, it was a top-down idealized model in a way to compensate the negative effects of the Industrial Revolution and the urban development of that. So the town halls, etc., were then town halls were then developed. And well, basically, it's also generalized, of course. This is mostly from a morphological point of view. So it was also said that the maximum size of a city should be around 25,000 people, but not really into how are these cities then really connected beyond something conceptually. Then by Sir Peter Hall in the 60s, and then developed it further, he observed and then explained too that the Randstad in a way has a similar role as, for example, monocities as London and New York, because of these smaller cities, but well connected via functional relations between the cities. And then a third one is for most the institutional side of polycentricity that has been developed, or at least been advocated by the European Commission. And that was basically when Europe was growing in the last decades to overcome Europe's monocentric urban economic structure, basically to spread out the effects of the blue banana. Well, overall, it's of course generalized, and many others have written papers on that. There are so many typologies, so many focuses on the morphological, the functional. Sometimes there is even debate between those dimensions, that it had led to a sort of a Babel's tower, that everybody claims or whatever, that this is the polycentricity analysis or framework that is better than the other in one way or another. And it's what is basically also the core of research, an ongoing, never-ending discussion. Well, what we have done, we have, of course, built upon that literature, and many others have said these three dimensions, you cannot really see them apart in a polycentric system. They all have an important role in its existence. What we have added to that is that we have said, yes, these dimensions indeed play a role, and first of all, they have to be connected among each other. But if that exists, then, and that's the concept of emergence, then from those interactions, a higher level property emerges. And then from that moment that that polycentric system, which is the higher level property, exists, at that moment, it has the capacity to constitute the three dimensions. So basically, at that moment, the polycentricity system, which is a system, can influence then the morphological, functional, and industrial side of that, of which it's constituted by. Now I dive into the empirics. In this paper, we have focused on oil, and that's not because we like oil, quite the contrary, but we have, well, that is the fact, ARA, which I just explained, is not an institutional political name. It's not there's a body of government that is called ARA and that deals with aspects of ARA. No, ARA, where it originally origins from, and still today, is an energy spot market. So, especially relevant today, ARA, among these four others, sets the price for all and all products on a daily basis. The ARA basically is a contract. That is on a daily basis, like I said, being traded on different international stock markets like the New York Max. And then, of course, by that trading, the price is set for oil, but also all products. And it's quite remarkable that an ARA, a contract, has a geographical name. Well, basically, the map already explains why. But ARA, as it is not one port, but it's three ports in that contract. So the contract, in a way, hints for functional polycentricity, because apparently the contract has influence or deals with activities that happen within these three different ports. So because it's in one contract, maybe there is functional, maybe there are relations in that system over there. And then, well, what we have then done in the paper is develop the three dimensions. So firstly, I will explain the morphological dimensions. So we have checked every dimension. Is it existing, and are there relations between them? So first of all, here's the morphological dimension. And what you see on the right map are these 6 ports, and you see differences, many differences. The pie chart is the added value generated by which activity. Mostly the blue color is dominant here. Blue color is logistics. Is industry. So some ports are more logistical ports, like Amsterdam and Zeebrugge. Other ports like the North Sea port, Moerdijk, and also Antwerp to some extent are, or get at least more money or more added value out of industrial activities. And Rotterdam, which is the biggest port here in this region, is foremost active on logistics. So we see, although these 6 ports are competing, also differences, so different specialities we already see in the economic profiles of them. And from a broader view or from a more abstract view, well, we can say, yes, there's a morphological polycentricity can be observed. Within the country, maybe more monocentric, but between or together, we can say morphological polycentricity. And then we also dived within the ports, focusing on these oil activities. What are these activities basically are is, well, three functions you can see here in the right upper corner. The refinery, where the oil is processed the first time, the crude oil. The petrochemical plant, where medicines are made or plastics, and the storage of it, the oil terminal. And what this map showed is, to some extent, also confirmed in this map. So Rotterdam is mostly large oil refineries. So the large crude oil ships come in, and then the first step exists. Many oil terminals. Antwerp is foremost chemical, so many products are made out of oil within Antwerp. And Amsterdam is only, on the right bottom, only terminals. Well, why is that? Because Amsterdam today is the largest fuel port in Europe. So the diesel, the gasoline is blended and exported from Amsterdam. Then the second dimension, the functional dimension, well, again, generalized. Within the PER literature, this is a very difficult dimension. And a lot of discussion is going on for example, within the Randstad, is it connected? Why is that so difficult to measure? Because PERs mostly, at least have the assumption that the agglomeration effects come from knowledge relations and knowledge sharing, but it's very difficult to measure knowledge, and you can use patents or whatever. So indeed, mostly proxies are used that are proxying the knowledge, such as commuting patterns, emails, or labor transfers. But every data, every data set you use shows mostly something different, nuances, mostly sometimes even contradicting results. And it's a bit a never-ending discussion. This is basically quite normal because it's our proxies, and it's not that you literally are able to measure knowledge relations. Well, that's why we also argue in the paper it could be not a bad idea to look at the port side, the maritime side of these cities, because you can literally follow the oil. And you see here, this is a picture from Rotterdam. You see here such an oil barge ship that is, well, in this case, it's going to Rotterdam, but it could also go the other way around to Antwerp or to Amsterdam. How did we do that? We developed a completely new methodology. Well, we used IS data, and IS data is automatic identification system. It's a safety system whereby a ship sends every 6 seconds its position, but that signal is also connected to many other data sets, like the type of ships, where it comes from, where it goes to, its speed, etc., etc. So what we basically did, quite a low scale, is we bought an antenna, and in an apartment in Rotterdam, we captured, in fact, we logged the data of IS for one summer, a few weeks during the summer of 2019. And this is, for example, a sample of 1 week, I guess, or 1 day, if I remember well, of 200,000 of these points. Then, of course, some analysis, some calculations we have done. And out of these data, we also developed a way to differentiate between the weight of ships. Because, of course, you cannot compare a barge like you saw in the picture with a very large crude ship of 320,000 tons that comes from the Middle East, for example. You cannot compare that one-on-one. So you have to have some notion of the weight or the size of the ships, which we have done. You can see on the right. And then the most interesting is, of course, the results. And indeed, and that was quite interesting. We have found a functional polycentric system. So the functional relations exist between the 6 ports within the ARA region. So basically, this is from the literature from PERS, we have shown literally by following the oil the functionally polycentric system here. And well, shortly explaining, Rotterdam is the largest, the most important point here, and then Antwerp, etc., etc. Then we looked into the firms the same that we did with the morphological dimension. And what we have found, or what you see here, is the confirmation that Rotterdam is from a logistical point of view, the most important node within this polycentric system. So basically, the large oil ships from the Middle East or Russia, well, maybe not today anymore, they arrive in Rotterdam, very large quantities, and from there the processing begins. And from Rotterdam, it is then going to other ports and other firms in ARA, and then the functional relations emerge. And what you see here that is the important role of Amsterdam, somewhere from a logistical point of view, which you could also see within the morphological economic profile, is indeed that Amsterdam is very important from a logistical point of view. But then if we filter out the logistics and only look at the relations that are important in the production, Antwerp completely pops up, Rotterdam almost disappears. So basically what we prove, in fact, is that Antwerp is indeed a petrochemical cluster, very important within the ARA. So that was the difference between these two maps.
Karel,
then the last dimension, sorry?
Karel, just if you can watch the time as well. Thank you.
Yes, I know. I have a timer here, so I'm trying to stick to that. The institutional dimension within PER, but also within port literature, is the newest one. So there is no institutional, like I said. Even in history, there are moments where Netherlands, Belgium, or Antwerp were actively blocking cooperation. So why is ARA then existing? Well, that's a beautiful story. It's because of local firms and global organizations and markets. So a very short story. Petroleum rise in Rotterdam, World War II, the Marshall Plan decides that Germany has to be dependent of other countries, while BP, Shell, Esso open their refineries in Antwerp, Rotterdam. That's the multi-gateway port region. There's an upscaling. Rotterdam quickly becomes the only port where these very large oil ships can arrive. A pipeline is constructed from Rotterdam to Germany, but these companies had already plans in Antwerp, so what to do? Oil could not arrive there anymore. Well, the firms themselves, they demanded from Belgium and the Netherlands, which they opposed, a pipeline between Rotterdam and Antwerp, so the oil could still go to Antwerp. Then the Iran Revolution come out, oil crisis, the West could not basically find oil anymore. They went to the spot markets, and ARA was then the way to set the price and lower the risk for buying oil. So the ARA future contract, which then comes out, is an institutional arrangement. And from that moment that contract existed, the institutional dimension was there, the market was there, and the companies within the different ports started to specialize and be complementary. And so from these interactions of these three dimensions, the polycentric system emerged, and basically since then, since the last few decades, more and more these dimensions specialized, so the polycentric system even became more important. So the last slides, what do we learn from this? Because, hey, we are going at least to a post-fossil world. Indeed, many transitions are ongoing, the energy transition, the geopolitical turmoil, at least since a few weeks, very much on the agenda, circular economy. Well, we argue from our results, that's in our paper also written, that history will repeat itself. So, for example, hydrogen and circularity, well, the logistical parts will foremost, from a latentness perspective, situated in Rotterdam, and most likely the circular and bio-based economy will foremost situate itself in Antwerp. So what you now could already predict in a way, that there's a high chance that ARA will be a crucial region in the energy transition and the circular economy transition, among many others. But the question is what to do then from a spatial policy or policy perspective in general. Well, nobody will be able to steer this. So it will probably be again an emergent polycentric system. So in a way, what you could do is not to block it. That is maybe the best lesson, but still it is a bit to see how it will emerge. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Karel, for such an interesting presentation. So I see that there are some questions in the chat already. And, you know, if anyone else wants to add the question directly, please raise your hand. In the meantime, I would read the ones that are in the chat. So I'll start with this one, which asks, is there any difference between polycentricity and economic corridors? And I would like to add like another point to that, which is, could you tell us a little bit more of how, you know, this polycentricity of ports, like, you know, the ARA case you have outlined, actually interact with the polycentricity of the region and the more traditional kind of polycentricity that we, you know, are perhaps more familiar with?
Yeah, very, very good question. I will start with your latest question. I did not show this, but I covered that in my PhD, and the papers related to my PhD is look within port cities. Are the maritime economy and the urban economy related? And was also focusing on the low countries. And from that research, it's a very safe answer. It depends. It depends on what you take into account. So some sectors, and then of course a little bit generalizing, some port cities too, are better related, the urban side and the maritime side, than others. In a way, Amsterdam is maybe the most separated, which also explains a little bit why there are so many spatial conflicts between the port land use functions and urban land use functions within Amsterdam. The other extreme, you could say, is Ghent in Belgium, where the relations, the economic relations, but also the social relations, even the cultural relations, are way more stronger. Antwerp is somewhere in between, and Rotterdam is also another story. So that's also other literature. Within Rotterdam, it's already proven that the high level of logistics has also brought a lot of management functions to Rotterdam. A lot of headquarters are based within the city of container firms. But also in Amsterdam, that's then a correction to what I just said. in Amsterdam, a lot of trading houses are there. So a lot of commodities are traded via Amsterdam. So that basically trade on the stock markets. So there is a connection between the polycentric site we looked in from a logistical point of view within more urban-based aspects of those. In a way, in fact, I would argue that there's not really a difference. It only depends on what you take into account and not. And if I then can continue, the other question was, what is the difference between polycentricity and economic corridors? Well, maybe I don't really understand what the specific economic corridor here is, but let's take the blue banana, for example, which in a way is an economic corridor. It has a lot of similarities. The difference, of course, is in what way is what the blue banana is described really something beyond the conceptual side. So it is a nice drawing. It's a banana. You have other conceptual ideas, but exactly proving in how they are related beyond basically safe agglomeration estimations is very difficult, like I explained. It's very difficult to show that.
Okay. And the same person also asks, what are the local and global policies that aided the growth and development of the area?
Yeah, that's quite interesting. That was I had to a little bit rush through those slides, but in the institutional dimension from a public side has always been blocked. It has never been allowed. It has even been actively blocked. So from the public policy dimensions that are relevant, so Belgium, Netherlands, and others, regions too, the port authorities, they always saw Rotterdam and Antwerp as the enemy. It was always our enemy. So it is the institutional explanation, the policies that really explain how that era polycentric port system exists, is from the firm side, which are also multinationals, and then the trading, the market processes that have made ARA then a contract. So it's both, it's local and global, but from a private side, not from a public side, and that's quite new in the per literature, which mostly looks only maybe even to the public side of policy.
Very interesting. And linked to that, there's another clarification question in the chat, which sort of asks, to what extent could be these functional relations within this urban cluster used for generalization on other trade goods and flows? And it kind of links up nicely to what we are discussing.
Yeah, that's a very good question. Thank you, Martin. Mostly, if in the port literature, they look at containers. I don't know why. It's maybe nice to see, but it is an observation that a lot of researchers look at containers, container flows, container terminals. And then indeed, Rotterdam is the arch enemy of Antwerp, because basically on containers, you cannot really work together. The interesting thing is that oil, in every step, changes. It goes from crude oil to intermediary oil, which then can become plastic or medicines or any product that is in front of your desk now. And eventually it can become a fuel that you use to drive a car or whatever. So on every, that's also within the per literature already a little bit explored, these networks are multiplied. There's the crude, only taking the crude oil into account, it's only Rotterdam and all the other rivalries. From petrochemicals, it's only Antwerp. From fuels, it's only Amsterdam. But exactly the relation between them shows that it is not competing, it is complementary. And basically, Antwerp would not be so important, so big without Rotterdam, and the vice versa. Rotterdam would be not such a big port without Antwerp around the corner. So if we take that insight, for example, other aspects like making cars, producing steel, the bio-based economy, which is now emerging, the circular economy, there are important lessons, because every port authority, every region, every country is now developing policies to become more sustainable, whatever. But it's always, we have to do everything, we have to be the best. It never, maybe from a European size a little bit, but within that, it's not really. saying we have to cooperate with Antwerp around the corner, which is strange because it's exactly the reason why the Netherlands or Belgium, the other way around, is so specialized.
Thank you, Karel. Very, interesting follow-up questions as well. So, are there any final points or questions that the audience would like to raise? Questions to Karel? I mean, we can have more space at the end for questions to both of the presenters. If not, I will move to Linda, which is the second keynote of today. So the floor is yours, Linda.
Thank you so much, Stefania, and thank you for inviting me to hold this presentation today. I'm delighted to be here, and it was fascinating to hear the talk from Karel as well, and I'm glad to see that we have so many questions from the audience. I look forward to engaging with them after my talk. So the presentation that I will do today is, as Stefania already explained, based on the LOAC project, which looks at climate innovation in ordinary cities, is led by Vanessa Castambrotto at the University of Sheffield. I will be presenting some of the findings that we have produced in relation to climate action in cities in China, but the ideas that I'm presenting are also relevant to a lot of the ideas that we're trying to formulate from this project, in particular, the ideas about the ordinary and the mundane, as I will come to in conclusion. But to situate first this analysis and current debates, the IPCC just released the chapters as a working group 2 of their 6th assessment reports on impact and vulnerability, overall painting a rather bleak picture on the future of the planet. But I would like to highlight 2 aspects of their findings that are relevant to the points I'm going to make today. The first one is that the IPCC authors emphasize that we need to have climate action in cities. There's a very strong focus on the high level of risk in urban areas, especially in contexts where there's a lack of infrastructure and basic services, which relates a lot to informal settlements, but also to rapidly growing small cities, which is our empirical focus in this paper. And secondly, this report really consolidates the language on systemic change. So in the chapter on cities, there's an entire subsection on transformative action. And this need, the language on the need for transitions to respond to climate breakdown is strong throughout the entire report. And we are focusing then in our analysis on transformative climate action. And we could say at this point that there's basically a consensus that we do need transformative climate action in urban areas, but there's a lot less agreement on how exactly is that going to look like and how are we going to deliver it. And also this very strong imperative is also raising new questions. One concern is that a lot of the urban policy, the urban climate policy that we have seen until today is not generating any transformative change at all. And we know that because we can look back at decades of urban climate action and see that it's actually pretty good at reproducing business as usual instead, or even at creating new problems. Like, for example, investment into new infrastructure can create new forms of exclusion and marginality related to access, incomes, and so forth in cities. So this kind of problem is documented in the literature on climate urbanism, which basically explains that most urban climate policies fixed in neoliberal logics that are reproducing the kind of inequalities that we've seen for a long time. Another concern is that most approaches to urban climate action and also their critiques are derived from very specific urban contexts. In particular, there's a lot of research on megacities and cities in the global north, and we know a lot less about climate action that is emerging in other contexts or geographies. And that is why in this article, we are examining climate urbanism strategies from elsewhere. And we argue that the literature on urban climate action has foregrounded certain places while othering others. In particular, flagship projects, eco-cities, urban labs, they have concentrated in the limelight, and modest projects in smaller cities or less internationally connected ones have disappeared into the shadows. And in engaging with these other spaces, we are inspired by Jennifer Robinson's ideas of ordinary cities, which suggests that we have to think about action or action in cities from the perspective of urban space that is lived rather than international global hierarchies. We are assuming that we can understand another perspective on climate action by studying these spaces. So specifically in this paper, we are exploring the prospects for transformation in urban China. And this constitutes a focus on the elsewhere for 2 reasons. The first is that most of the research in urban China has focused on capitals and megacities, at least in the Anglophone scholarship. And that tends to foreground a certain perspective on climate urbanism that focuses on technology, on capital investments, and state leadership. And the second reason is that climate urbanism in China represents an elsewhere from this perspective of Eurocentric theories that have really dominated the field of urban climate research. And we have argued, we, Vanessa and Ping-Huan, who is the second postdoc in the project and also author on this paper, that these perspectives are completely inadequate often to capture any action on the ground in urban China, because they are frameworks that were developed for a completely different political system, social relations, values, and so forth. And there's an imperative, obviously, to understand what is actually happening on the ground. Just a few words on how we understand transformation before I will give a full account of our empirical results. Broadly, we are understanding transformations in this study as processes that are challenging structures that maintain high carbon growth and vulnerability in the context of climate change. And we have engaged with this concept a lot in our previous publication and also critiqued it, but we've chosen in this paper to use the framework that is shown in this slide, which assumes that there are different kinds of actions that can lead to different forms of change that is symbolized by these spheres of action. We have the practical one, which relates to technological responses, often readily available solutions. So in the context of urban planning, it can be, for example, efficiency upgrades of infrastructure or physical structures that protect against flooding, for example. The political sphere, on the other hand, involves changes in political systems and institutions, which in the context of urban planning can relate to local government structures or planning processes and so forth. And then we have the personal sphere of action, which consists of beliefs and worldviews and paradigms of thinking, usually understood to be very difficult to shift and to be outside the sphere of urban planning interventions. So how do all of these ideas apply to ordinary cities in China then? Well, our methodology focused on examining initiatives that are already taking place, so things that are already happening on the ground. We selected 12 cities that are listed on this slide. All of these basically were new locations to me that I'd literally never heard of before, but they are places where the population is rapidly growing. They're adding 4% per year, and they have almost 1 million inhabitants leading up to 2020, which is obviously a lot, but interestingly considered small cities in the context of China then. And our analysis and data collection, which was led by Ping, focused on collecting a unique data sets of climate programs that are happening here, 82 in total, which we collected by compiling materials from different sources, and then collected a repository or database of these, and then analyzed them to see what kind of patterns are emerging from these initiatives. We found 3 clusters of action, which I will now go into in some detail to try to explain what forms of climate interventions are happening here. So the first cluster, which consisted of 22 initiatives, includes projects that leave some sort of material imprint on a city in the physical environment. They concentrate in different sectors, including housing, industrial development, transport, waste, energy, for example. And they include a range of initiatives that target infrastructure or facilities, either new ones or retrofitting them. So the example that I have in this slide here is the Biloa National Urban Minerals Demonstration Base, which is basically, there's this idea of creating a new form of economic foundation or activity in the city by recycling materials and extracting valuable minerals. So as you can understand, this is a kind of project that is very attractive for private sector leadership and also national demonstration projects, because it often involves new forms of capital investment and even new sources of revenue or tax foundations and so forth. So we found that there's something common to all of the climate action projects in cluster 1. All of them are sector-based, and mostly they're not particularly original. Essentially, we could find them anywhere in the world, and they tend to be they tend to all have a practical approach that is in line with this first sphere of transformative action. And our results here align with previous studies that show that these kind of programs are quite common, but also that they have a distinct tendency towards business as usual. Then we have a second cluster of 36 initiatives, which includes projects that have some form of institutional change as the core process of change. And these are mostly some form of cross-cutting interventions that involve interventions in multiple sectors, like waste, for example, also target households. And they're also often located in multiple places within the city. So let's say, or even the hinterland, like for example, if it's a water management strategy, it may involve management of the entire river that reaches into the hinterland and so forth. About 70% of these are led by local government, but we also found some interesting forms of collaborations that involve other actors, and they were particularly likely to involve different kinds of social innovation. So for example, the example that I have in this slide is from Ensure. It's an initiative to support green tourism, which we've translated into poverty alleviation through tourism. Every family builds a hotel. So the idea is that farmers can open up their homes for visitors and displaying food and entertainment. And together the city can collectively reimagine the cultural capital of the city and also ecological resources for a different development model. All of these initiatives also have something in common. They're directed towards changing institutional factors that shape the economy and social practices in the city. So they relate to the political sphere of transformation, but we're not seeing the kind of actions that we would imagine in a liberal democratic context, obviously, where we talk a lot about social movements, say emergency climate declarations, these kind of things, protests, but rather they involve relatively modest interventions that are targeting the structures of local governments or how to value local resources and so forth. And finally, we have a third cluster, which are directed towards shifting cultural systems in different ways. So it includes a range of awards, celebrations, festivals, and different forms of attempts at shifting consumption practices. And here we have a lot of different actors that are leading these kind of projects, but always targeting someone else who's supposed to be internalizing these messages, citizens, consumers. So for example, in this slide, we have an example from Loha, where there's a new craze with low carbon weddings. So you can see here that there's an idea that you can eliminate wasteful decorations or bike to the venue instead of taking the car. Obviously it can seem like a rather peripheral kind of climate action, but the wedding industry is actually massive in China. So it could have a material significance, especially if it were linked with identities and value systems more broadly. So this cluster of initiatives, the objective obviously is to create some sort of profound change of culture and valuation of urban life. We found that these initiatives are very ambitious in the way that they're imagining change, but very modest in what they're actually doing. And it's very difficult for us to see any kind of pathway towards this ideal future that is imagined. So I have two final slides where I want to reflect on what this empirical material tells us. First of all, what does the focus on what we've called the elsewhere teach us about urban climate action? Well, we can see that the narratives of climate action, they permeate planning in all kinds of cities, not just flagship projects, but also smaller cities that are a lot less well known. And we could expect that that would be the case in a centralized country, well, centralized, long discussion of what that means in China, but where there's a delegation of targets, so local authorities adopt guidelines, but the diversity that we encountered suggests that this is a phenomenon that goes beyond that. Which leads to a second point, which is that the cities that we studied really differ in their practices of climate action. And we can see clearly that the programs that we documented are shaped by histories, by industrial profile, natural resource endowment, local politics, social demands, and so forth. And third is that the focus on ordinary cities may draw attention to aspects that are overlooked when we're looking at shiny megacity projects. So we do find a lot of examples of capital accumulation oriented strategies, but actually that is a small share, and the majority are focusing on institutional change and cultural change, where citizens tend to take up a more important role than you would normally assume. For example, in the climate urbanism literature, they tend to feature just as sort of at the receiving end of risk, and in state-led narratives in China, they seem to be basically not important at all. So finally, a few words about what we can say about transformative potential based on this. And a lot of conclusions are linked with the ideas about the association between transformative processes and place. So we can see that the initiatives in the first clusters, they deliver mostly place-based work in terms of their concrete locations where an intervention happens. But paradoxically, these are actually the ones that have the least place-based characteristics, because they're ready-made solutions that you can move around across locations. In terms of transformation, they could actually have a significant impact in terms of flows of materials. especially if they're scaled up. And we can expect that the processes would look quite similar to contexts that we're more familiar with in urban climate research. In contrast, the initiatives in cluster 2 and 3, they could achieve impact by engaging with host institutions and cultural practices, but so far we really don't know what kind of material impact they might have. And they also raise some new difficult questions for planning because of their tight connection with place-based characteristics. So the most meaningful programs in particular that we found in cluster 2 are very deeply linked with conditions of a city, suggesting that it would be very difficult to sort of extract some best practice lessons from them and integrate them to a planning process that you can then replicate even in other places in China, but definitely somewhere else. We also see that with the programs in cluster 3, they represent a very specific style of thinking of how climate action could happen, which is aimed at some form of mass mobilization of the public towards the public goal. And this clearly reflects a legacy of political campaigns in communist politics in China, which is something that we just don't know very much about in the Anglophone literature, and it's definitely not integrated into the literature into the planning literature. Again, this observation shows how a process of transformation will look very different in cities across geographies, in this case due to a specific political history or political culture. A final point is that really, if we look at all of the interventions in our sample, none of them are transformative, at least not in the traditional sense that we usually use that term in terms of tackling the root causes of environmental degradation. But some of the interventions are making an enormous difference to individual lives. For example, when they're explicitly addressing life conditions of poor communities. So for example, the example from Anshe that I just mentioned, rising incomes for migrants or returning to the city is one of the key focuses of this program, which we know that migrant populations are a vulnerable group in China, and this is making a huge difference to these households that are included in these interventions. So overall, when we think about, or a lot of the debates about climate transformation in China tend to be really interested in problems of scale and speed, because of simply the challenge of greenhouse emission reduction is so overwhelming that it's a lot of quantitative orientation of those debates. But in contrast, if we're focusing on people's life experience, it really implies a different perspective of what is being transformed, what is a meaningful transformation. So our final argument in this paper is that thinking of climate action from the perspective of the ordinary shows how the transformative is inseparable from the mundane, because that is the only way that it can create meaningful change for the people who are actually living in the city. Thank you.
Thank you, Linda. Are there any questions from the floor? Otherwise, while you think about it, maybe I can ask a question to Linda. And I found it very fascinating, and you mentioned very well the institutional and cultural factors that might also influence transformative climate action beyond the other factors that you have highlighted. I was wondering whether you could tell us something about other external factors as well, for example, COVID and the impact that it might have on transformative climate action, and whether it has created new problems or raised new awareness of different kinds, or whether you have observed any of these, or what are your ideas as well?
Well, the impact of COVID, I think this is very complex. Are we speaking about urban politics now, or more transformative pressure in the context of Chinese politics, would you say?
Well, both,
I think what we saw during the COVID pandemic in China, and I'm really not an expert on this, so I don't want to say too much about things that I don't know that much about, but the debates that I followed was that there was a lot of support for strong state leadership, for new forms of technological deployment that we're seeing are being translated into the forms of climate action that are also prevalent. So I think that the debate elsewhere concentrated a lot about focusing on what we know about who was vulnerable in the city, because we saw that with the COVID pandemic, the low-income households in the UK, for example, ethnic minorities were the ones that were affected the most. This also translate into the same vulnerabilities that we see in climate change, and this is something that we really have to pay attention to. That has implication for how we plan the cities of the future. Like, what do we do with density, for example? It might be good for mitigation, but bad for transmission of viruses. So there was a lot of debates on that. I'm not sure, however, to what extent that has translated into the politics of China, because I think the pathways that are set through the climate targets are quite far into the future, and they have been solid for a very long time. I don't think that path is going to change by that kind of pressure, including, we have an interesting debate also about the geopolitical shift that may be occurring by increasing stability in Europe, don't we? But I think that, if anything, the state's sort of commitment and leadership in China has been strengthened by a lot of these dynamics. And while we might see new forms of experimentation, which we always see in China, new practices that evolve from bottom up, maybe learnings, for example, from the pandemic, I think that will be integrated into the existing planning directions and broad strategies that they have in the 5-year plan, for example, going forward.
Oh, thank you. Very, very interesting. Thank you. There are a couple of more questions in the chat. So one question asked, I would like to know if you have look into how grassroots power is built and organized for climate actions to counterbalance the pro-growth coalition.
In China or everywhere?
It doesn't say, but I guess it's in China.
Yeah, because everywhere you see a very strong movement. Obviously, I was at COP26, and I think that the resistance is a pushback from all of the constituencies there were extremely strong, particularly youth and indigenous people. And we really see a shift in the discourse that is being also embedded in things like climate emergency declarations and so forth. A lot of that is explicitly pushing back against business-led interventions and growth-oriented development. So I think that is a very, very interesting turn that is happening right now. In China, me and my colleague, actually, Ping Huang, has written several papers on the complexity of trying to understand how this works in China, because we often have a very sort of an imaginary of what civil society and what social resistance looks like that we like to import, that we then take these analytical frameworks and we try to study it there in China. It doesn't look the same, and then often a lot of scholarship concludes that it's not there. I think that's completely incorrect, and that is sort of a hangover of thinking through these processes through Anglophone and Eurocentric frameworks. So we'd have done a lot of research recently in terms of thinking of what does mobilization or public participation look like in this context. It looks very different. It can be defensive. It can be legal, for example. A lot of the resistance that we've seen against the states and corporations in China comes through individual lawyers, for example, who are campaigning and trying to actually implement regulation, getting back at the state with their own tools. It's really interesting, and I hope that there will be a lot more research on that coming up.
Thank you, Linda. Another question from Chandrima. How about scientific evidence on climate change at a global scale? Does it influence them to take climate action?
Again, I'm not sure if this is everyone or the government of China. I don't know if the person wants to clarify.
It doesn't specify, as usual, so maybe just
okay, does it? Well, I'll do the same as I did for the last question.
It says my question is for China. So yeah.
For China, okay, thank you. China has an extremely strong tradition of formulating questions based on scientific and technological expertise. That is something that has been misunderstood a lot in the former communist regime, but even, for example, under the Mao era, there was a very, very strong focus on developing society based on scientific evidence, and even a process of technological experiments or other forms of experiments that is feeding back into central government guidelines. So I think that we've seen that with climate change, since its very inception, the government is very receptive to its advice from basically they have research institutes that are very close to the government that are also obviously funded by public money. So they're oriented towards guidelines which have always understood very clearly what the climate change is about. There has not been as we've seen elsewhere, the pushback from corporations, for example, to say climate change is fake, that was never the problem. What they've done instead is to say, well, sorry guys, but actually the industrialized world, former colonial powers have caused this problem, you should sort this out, rather than, you know, asking us to reduce our emissions first. All of the historically accumulated emissions are yours. So there's been a political negotiation there in the international meetings, for example, with China saying, okay, well, I mean, we're not going to reduce if you don't reduce first. That has now changed a little bit because climate change has translated into a domestic political issue to a very large extent in China. It's related to energy security, air pollution, health problems. And I think that all of the policies that they're implementing have a very strong dialogue with scientific information, even though maybe often social concerns might be less pronounced.
Okay. Thank
Social
you.
Justice priorities, I should say.
Yeah, for the very comprehensive answer. Last question that I have in the chat for you looks at whether you have highlighted, again, in the context of China and climate action, any differences between the city center and its peripheries?
Yes. Yeah, that's a really important question. And even more what we see in the context of all of China's development politics, including climate policies, the enormous, devastating difference between provincial, like provinces in terms of where they are in their economic development patterns, and also urban and rural areas. So we have an enormous social divides there and completely different kind of problems that they're struggling with. So I think there's a centralized, obviously, planning system, which means that in the context of the central and provincial and the municipal government, there will always have been some sort of evaluation of what are the natural resources in our entire area, where are we going to develop economic activities. Actually, it relates a little bit to Karel's presentation, isn't it? There's the strategic thinking there in terms of what are the infrastructure networks, how we're going to ship these things. So we're going to put the ports over there, and they're going to be supplying a specific kind of development, which another part of the province, for example, would do something else. So this will be very systematically evaluated in central and provincial and municipal planning documents, and you can see sort of the trickle-down effect of, okay, these are ecological zones that we have to protect because of the carrying capacity of the entire region. We got water scarcity over there. Things like that. Not always implemented, but the planning is very structured in terms of these considerations, I would say.
Okay, thank you, Linda. Very good, answers and clarifications. Thank you. So, unless there are any final points that anyone from the audience would like to make, I think we've reached the end of this keynote, and Karel, Linda, do you want to make any closing remarks, perhaps?
I had a question for Linda, though.
Yes, go ahead.
Yeah. So your presentation was wonderful, by the way. You showed those three circles, no? Don't really recall what it was, but in the middle was practical, I guess, and then it went to institutional and societal. And it bridged a bit to my research, this paper and others. What is ongoing at the moment, for most in Amsterdam, is that climate change, circular economy, whatever discourse, energy transition, is in fact used, let us point implicitly, used to push out industrial functions, remanufacturing, waste plants, which we know from industrial ecology that are crucial to improve or even keep emission levels, treatment of resources, job creation, etc., etc. But that's in fact the consequence of focusing for the last decades on oil. From a political point of view, it's something we don't want anymore, but it connects to all kinds of manufacturing functions at the moment. So using climate change, in fact, it is pushing out and basically to construct more houses. That's basically what is happening. Do you see then, if you would use your framework, I think you would say, yeah, in the middle, those are the functions that at the moment maybe have generated the most emissions, but are also the solution. And the other ones, of course, have to connect. It has to be a behavioral change, have to be an institutional change. But what you see is the fact that those circles, if I may say, are now in fact used to push out the middle one in specific places. So basically, it even makes the transition worse or backwards or whatever. Do you see that too in your case studies?
Can I respond and also ask a question to Karel as well? Are we allowed to do
Sure.
that? Do you have time? Yeah, awesome. Yeah, thank you. That's a really good question. I think that you are right. What I have been seeing a lot in my research, and we've also started to write about that, is that climate change has become a legitimizing label for basically anything you want to do. So it's just attached to anything that happens to be, opportunistic for someone to do at the moment. You call it climate change, you can do it because it's everyone's largest concern, and it is. I mean, I work on this because it is my largest concern, but it is very problematic that the term is so flexible that we can, for example, say we don't want industry, we want houses, for example. It's not going to help anywhere. We've just written a paper on how certain ideas become attached to this idea of transformative climate action, and as soon as it has done that, it allows you to do all kinds of things in the name of radical change, which isn't radical at all. My perspective on that is, though, that I think that both in terms of oil industries and in housing, we haven't really tackled any of the root causes there in terms of extractivism, in terms of like perpetual growth and consumer, high consumption patterns, all of that, and the inequality in the global economy. Don't even get me started on that. So I think that all of these are basically just a chimera or a facade for something that you don't want to do as a politician. So it's a very good question. And I have one back to you as well, which your presentation was also fascinating. My understanding from your talk is that we can see very clearly that this is a polycentric system. It's organized according to sort of self-organizing rules, and networks. It's dominated by infrastructures and market forces like the stock market and corporations. It seems like governments don't have much to do in there. They might not be able to control any of that. So your last slide was about transitions, and it's interesting to me that that is a field that has come out of the Netherlands, which the government wants to use for its own purposes. Your study seems to say that they're not going to be able to do that at all. Is it credible? Like, how can the government step in and shape a process that is clearly completely out of their hands?
Yeah. I don't have the answer to that. I don't think there is one answer to that, but it's quite in planning journals or planning literature, we focus implicitly or mostly explicitly a lot on public policy making. But we often forget that a lot of things that happen are, of course, the result of actions taken by many actors, and firms in this story are very relevant in that. And those firms are not, I think, among those firms you saw passing by in those slides, none of them is Dutch or Belgian. They're all international. If they have any link to whatever place, it's at least not Dutch or Belgian. But they have, of course, within their structure as a multinational company, specific locations with stakes, investments, sunk costs, and knowledge creation. Of course, that has a value. So that specific location within that firm has, of course, a very important value. And because many of these companies have both a location within Rotterdam and Antwerp, it is in their interest, of course, that both function well. And then, of course, geography plays a role. Some processes you cannot do in Antwerp, the other way around in Rotterdam, because of the economic structure there, cultural and logistic sites. And the company itself is trying to diversify or optimizing or embedding within existing ecosystems and investments, in international investments that are drawn to those clusters, etc., etc. And at some point, of course, the government is very important. A company cannot on its own establish a pipeline between Antwerp and Rotterdam. It has to have a permission to do that. And then, of course, the government plays a very important role. At the moment, that is what is happening with hydrogen. Many governments are making up policies to allow, at least facilitate mostly, these new production processes. But what we have found is that although governments have blocked these infrastructures and even these diversification, in the end it happens. So in the story of ARA, as it is today, the government is the arch enemy, you could say, of all these processes. I think in a way we know that climate change and all these transitions are so important, and we have to, as quick as possible, go towards hydrogen and whatever technology will pop up, circular economy, whatever, that the best lesson is maybe for governments, don't block it. Maybe don't do anything, that's maybe already the best, but at least or aim for facilitation. And then the question is on what, and that's very difficult, because every government has, of course, its own stakes. So the Netherlands policy making will always favor Rotterdam and not Antwerp, of course, and the other way around. And there's no institutional level that says, okay, we have to, for the sake of the planet or society, be sure that we use such international network. But there's not really an institutional body from the public side that is allowed to do that. European Commission to some extent, but still. So it's quite interesting for lessons for the transition.
Yeah.
No.
And I think it's, becoming increasingly more of a planning question. It's like, with a lot of private stakeholders, like in your case, then what can the government achieve becomes, key question, because in some cases, it's even in cities, like who owns the city is not anymore necessarily the public sector, and therefore it becomes more difficult to set regulations and conditions or even to steer the direction of change and of the big kind of debates that we are facing, and one of which is climate change, of course. So yeah, I think this was a fascinating discussion, really. And, thank you very much to both of you for sharing also even more within the Q&A. I would like to remember to the audience that the recording of the session can be soon viewed through the RSA Hub as well. Next up in the program, there will be more parallel sessions, including a number of special sessions from our festival partners. And on further highlights, there's also an OECD organized plenary tomorrow, Wednesday, 30th of March. Well, one tomorrow and the other one on Wednesday, 30th of March. So you can view again all the sessions on the RSA Hub, and you can use either the mobile app or desktop version. So thank you very much again to everyone for tuning in today, and goodbye.